tips for your relationships, 10 minutes. Okay, so last week we talked about how or does our childhood affect our, relationships once we grow up, become adults, and get into these romantic relationships. And I was thinking about that too. It's not just our romantic relationships that our childhood has a great effect on, but just friendships, all kinds of relationships, okay? But we talked just a bit last week, and I'll just kind of reiterate a couple things. We had talked about how our childhood shapes, who we are and how we show up in our relationships when we become adults, because our only reference are the things that we learned and how we were engaged when we were growing up. So things like unspoken, rules, or the rules that were set up in our home, um, expectations. We grow up with certain expectations of how people engage us, how we engage others, different roles. Some families are very traditional, some are not. I talked about those families that are very matriarchal in how things are ran, um, the hierarchy, the power structure in the family. We talked about that a little bit. I talked about how when we were children, how we were taught to love and show affection has a great deal to do with how we show up in our relationships, the different values and priorities that we have. And then, our problem solving. And I didn't really talk about that very much, but our problem solving skills are extremely important when it comes to the success of our relationships. Yes, how we go about solving problems is huge. And so that's a different tip. I won't go into that today. But that was something that I did discuss last week when I talked about how our childhood has a great effect on our relationships. So this week, I kind of want to keep that going, but I want to see it from just a different angle, or a more specific angle. I want to talk about how our birth order has an effect on our relationships. Yes, our birth order. Yeah. So if you are in a family of more than just one child, so if you're not the only child in your family, then you do have a birth order. Well, if you're the only child, you have a birth order. You're first and the only. But for instance, in my family, I am the oldest. I'm the eldest child. And so my birth order had a lot to do with how I showed up in my relationship with my husband. So not only does birth order have a lot to do with how we are in our relationships, but of course the culture. We talked about that last week, and I mentioned some things just a minute ago. But when we have a different birth order in our growing up, when we're growing up and we have a different birth order from the person that we're in a relationship with, that means we have had different experiences. Mm-hmm. We had some different experiences growing up. And those different experiences that we had have helped to shape our behavior, our personalities, and our relatability. Mm-hmm. Has a whole lot to do with that. So we learned who or how to be who we are through how we were engaged, how our parents engaged us, our siblings, the people in our families, the people close, how people interacted with us when we were growing up has a lot to do with how we show up and what we expect in relationships. Very important to know that. Sometimes it's not just the love and all that romantic stuff that we experience in a relationship that keeps us going and keeps us strong and keeps the relationship going and has longevity. But it's just sometimes it's an awareness of who we are and how we show up And also not just having an awareness of who we are, but having an awareness of who our spouse is, our significant other, knowing where they came from, their family structure, and how all that went down. That is important stuff to know. Okay, very important stuff to know. Like I said, I was the eldest, or am the eldest in my family, and on the flip side of that, my husband is the youngest. I'm the oldest of two girls and three boys, and my husband is the youngest of five boys. Last week I talked about how I came from a home where my mom worked, and then I had talked about how his mom was a stay-at-home mom, highly respected position. But when we got married, it was things were just a little strange for me because my husband was called the baby of the family. I've never been called the baby of the family. And so when we were engaged as the babies, talked to, or those are the babies of the family, that was something different for me. At first, I don't know, I didn't know how I really felt about that because I felt like we're all grown up in here and we're not babies, but I had to realize that that was his birth order, that was his position in the family. Now, flip side of that is when he would come to my side of the family, we were the oldest. We were I'm the oldest in my family. So we were the oldest of the children in the family. So my siblings looked up to me. They came to me for advice. I pretty much was, had a mother-like role, due to the fact that my mom did work. And so it was something completely different for us. We really truly had some different experiences. And it took us a while to really become aware of that, to know that our positions in our family had a lot to do with how we interacted with one another. I was always seeing things from a leadership point of view. I was always seeing things from, hey, I'm the oldest, I'm the firstborn. So, you know, that means I had some characteristics that were a little different. So I just kind of want to run through some things, some characteristics that show up in birth order. So the first child, the oldest child, that would be me. Oldest children tend to be the ones who are a little more on the perfectionist side. First of all, you're the guinea pig of the family. Your parents learned everything on you. So you were the first to walk, to talk, to go through puberty, to drive, to date. You were the first in everything. But in birth order, families that have more than one child, the oldest tends to be a little more organized. They are like list makers. I know I'm a list maker. I make a list for everything. They're leaders. They're responsible. They take life seriously. I know I can be a little over the board serious sometimes. And they crave details. Okay. And then one thing about the eldest, they are really critical on themselves. Okay. And these are some of the same attributes that the only child can have as well. Now, the middle, they're the negotiators, the mediators, right? Because they're in the middle, they've learned how to negotiate. Unfortunately, they're the least likely to be noticed. If one, two, three, four, five, okay, sometimes people aren't checking for number three in the middle. Sometimes they are more friend oriented because they're like, I'm too old for the oldest, I'm too young for the oldest child, I'm too old for the youngest child, so I'll hang out with my friends. And they're very loyal people. The last born or the youngest, they're charmers. Yes, charmers, charmers, charmers. They're the apple of the parents' eyes. They're secretive, very independent. They're people oriented. Yes, they are people oriented, and typically they're used. Now, this was really interesting. The youngest can be used a lot to get what everybody wants. So what'll happen is they'll send the youngest in. If we want ice cream, send the youngest in there. He'll do a little kissy face, and we'll get what we want. They're more affectionate. They're more engaging. They're more impulsive, and they like to be the center of attention. So let me just say this. Birth order has a lot to do with how we show up in our relationships and how we engage each other. We can't do anything about where we were born in our families, what order, but we can do something about being aware of our behavior and our characteristics, and being aware of where our spouses, kind of fall in line in their families as well, so that we can make some decisions about how we're going to engage each other and what the culture of our families are going to be. Well, I've ran out of time. This is a very interesting subject matter that we can go on, and I think I'm going to pick it up again next week. But these are my 10-minute tips. Birth order has a lot to do with how we engage each other in our relationships.